Hello, and welcome to the Year of Social Media seminar. Thank you for coming. Before I start, I just want to mention next week's speaker, mostly because people are usually gone by the time the talk is over. Next week, on the 5th of April, I believe, we're having Esther Hargitay from Northwestern University. And also, I just want to mention that this talk series and the talks before and the talks following have been sponsored by the Illinois Informatics Institute, Coordinated Science Laboratory, and the College of Media. And now, our speaker today is Daniel Gatica-Perez. He is visiting us from Switzerland. He is senior researcher at IDIAP Research Institute and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne, Switzerland. He directs the social computing group there. And just to give you a hint of the type of work that he does, he studies social dynamics, of small groups. He looks at ubiquitous computing, sensing environments, mobile computing environments, and he does this using social science techniques and machine learning. So without further ado, Daniel.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks also, Christian, for the invitation and hosting me. And I'm going to talk about video blogging and the perspective I have, which is essentially a perceptual processing view on blogging. So I'm sure that during the session question, we'll have lots of opportunities to look at all the perspectives. First and foremost, this is a joint work with one of my PhD students, Johan Isaac Bill, who's now in his third year of graduate studies. And also, it's joint work with Oya Aran, who is a postdoctoral fellow in my research group. So I think it's fair to say that we are moving from thinking that everything exists to end up in a book, which was this 19th century view, to Susan Sontag's view of everything exists to end up in a photograph, to something like everything exists to end up in YouTube, right? And according to this view, I think most of us have seen people blogging like this, right? Just broadcasting themselves. And I found actually a very interesting quote by David Foster Wallace in an essay called Authority in American Usage. It's not actually about blogging or video blogging, but it's actually very, very well in tune with what video blogging is about. The possibility of people exposing themselves, presenting themselves, and the tension that presenting themselves in front of an audience has in terms of how they believe about themselves and what people would believe about, other people would believe about themselves. This essay was actually talking about dictionary usage, not about blogging. What is true is that video blogs, for those who have experienced it, really provide a very rich communication experience. Whether it is people blogging from college, people blogging from home, or even President Obama blogging about the next election, video blogs have, at least for some part of the society, just become sort of a natural thing to do. Ways of looking for information, ways for looking for recipes. For certain parts of the population, they can get advice about certain things to do, like makeup, or what they should shop as the next big thing. And certainly, there's more and more interest in online video, right? So this is really not news to anybody. Video blogging has been studied now for several years, and Burgess and Green had a very interesting paper, have a very interesting book called YouTube, in which they perform an analysis of about 5,000 video blogs, and they found that 40% of the most popular content in terms of social interaction, number of subscribers, number of people who actually look at this, not necessarily in terms of number of views, correspond to video blogs. So blogs are, you should excuse my Spanish, I tend to use V and B the same way. All the time I'm going to be talking about video blogs. Video blogging is a very, very creative form of communication and participation in YouTube and other online video sites that is used both for documenting your life and in general for communication. And as I said before, it is a really rich social experience. Rich beyond text because you have people actually talking, and as I'm going to argue in the rest of the talk, rich because all the nonverbal channel, which we typically have access to in face-to-face communication, is also available through video blogging. It is also rich because in addition to the video, you have access to all the metadata. So if you are doing research in social media, you have access to essentially the same type of data in many ways that you have in, for instance, Facebook or Twitter. You have access to ratings, comments, and specifically video responses, which is a particular phenomena within YouTube in which people comment or respond to certain video blogs by video blogging themselves. So this creates a very interesting dialogue mediated through video in some cases, and mediated through comments, ratings, and other forms of text input that people give to each other. And there's plenty, and obviously more and more work on YouTube. And what is interesting about doing research in YouTube is that pretty much from whatever perspective you come from, in computing or in social science, there's a problem to analyze there. So here I've been trying to categorize existing work in YouTube, some of which has been done in video blogging, and most of it has not. And I'm going to just try to summarize what sort of interest people have had about YouTube and blogging in particular. First and foremost, I would like to highlight the work done in ethnography. And Patricia Lange had proposed a very interesting concept that she calls social media circuits, which refers to this ongoing discussion through video blogging, the possibility of creating circuits of content and circuits of people through the possibility of sharing video online. Very importantly, other people have investigated the issue of creating an online identity and how you create it and how to maintain it in YouTube. And this is very important because people might ask whether what you see on camera actually corresponds to the real person or not. So should we think about personas rather than actual people when they present themselves on video? Other people have looked at patterns of video creation and consumption in YouTube from the perspective of the user-generated content approach that other people think of when they think of YouTube. In a different context, people have looked at YouTube as a large-scale network. So there have been also several interesting works looking at the networking aspects of YouTube, looking at aspects of the discovering clusters, discovering patterns of traffic, discovering popularity, only looking at network approaches. Other people, as I list there, have looked at the possibility of aggregating metadata that is readily available on YouTube and use that metadata to characterize users, or in some cases to characterize communities. In particular, people have looked at social features, which in this particular context represents the number of subscribers that you have, or the number of subscriptions that you have towards other people, looking also at a combination between the number of views, the number of comments, ratings, and so on. And other people have focused more on the social network aspects of metadata. Other people have looked at comparing user-generated content with professional content, with a hypothesis that whether it is true or not that the videos are actually that different, not only in terms of what they contain, but in the way in which they are produced. And very recently, also, people have started looking at phenomena that are very specific, if you want, very specific to YouTube, one of which being ideological perspectives on topics. So people at CMU have investigated the possibility of detecting camps for topics that are potentially conflicting among different populations. And also people have started looking at thinking of YouTube in general, or video blogging in particular, as an ongoing conversation, where people can join at any time, exploiting the asynchronous nature of YouTube and continuing dialogue over time. Finally, there's obviously also a lot of work in video-mediated communication, video conferencing, and more recently, communication over the internet that is also very, very related to this topic of video blogging. And this is just a little picture for a book that will be edited later this year that contains some very interesting essays about communication over the web. The other flavor of this talk is nonverbal communication. And as I'm going to discuss in more detail in the talk, nonverbal communication is giving us the possibility of looking at YouTube from a different perspective, not only from the text sources, but from the other channel. And this is textbook information for people who take nonverbal communication courses. So it is well known that we have additional channel through which we express many of our states, the attitudes we have, the relationship we have with other people, and some of our traits too. And the nonverbal communication cues can vary from facial expressions to hand gestures to gaze to different forms of expressions, proximity between people, body posture, and so on. And the amount of research that has been done in social science regarding nonverbal communication is really, really significant. And what I've been trying to do is to rescue some of these concepts and to try to see how they are applicable to analysis of social media. Why is it important to use nonverbal communication cues in video blogging? So as I mentioned, it is known that nonverbal cues are alternative to written words and indicate really a lot about the state of people. At the same time, there's more and more awareness about the fact that, more and more evidence about the fact that some of these so-called social signals are honest in the sense that they very often are unconscious and difficult to control or to fake. And at the same time, it's been also documented in the cognitive science community that we humans are very good in general to make assessments about other people's abilities, other people's states or traits, using very limited observations, what is called in the literature thin slicing. So nonverbal behavioral cues as a whole offer a very interesting aspect of research that can be seen, if you want, as complementary to words, but that will have a lot of challenges by themselves. And there's actually an emerging body of work that is focusing on trying to understand different types of social interactions from sensor data. In particular, people have investigated social constructs like attraction, roles, personality, dominance, and leadership, mainly in small group or dyadic conversations, typically in lab situations. And what my work and the work of my collaborators are aiming at doing is to move from the face-to-face case to the social media case. And just to give you an example of two very well-studied concepts in social psychology, I'm just going to tell you a list of well-known nonverbal cues that are correlated to specific cases of dominance and extraversion. So it has been documented, and this is just a summary, that dominant and in some cases extroverted people tend to talk louder, tend to talk longer, tend to speak first or interrupt more to other people, are typically more kinesically expressive in the sense that they move more and with a richer range of motion. They often gesticulate when they talk. They also receive more visual attention when they are in a face-to-face conversation. And they have very interesting patterns of looking at others while they talk and looking at others while they listen. All of this is, as you can see, work that has been developed in some cases over more than 40 years. And what is interesting from the perceptual processing perspective is that some of these cues, if you want to think about videos and cameras and microphones, is that some of them are really audio-based, some of them are, in this case, motion-based, and some of them are attention-based. And as I'm going to show you in a moment, and this is an increasing, there's increasing agreement in the computer vision community that some of these nonverbal cues are now more and more, if you want, able to be extracted by computers, just because the state of the art in computer vision and audio processing allow us to do so. Of course, there are plenty of challenges, and this is also information that you can find in nonverbal communication textbooks. First of all, nonverbal cues are very often subtle, and this creates problems for extracting them automatically. Second, there are plenty of inconsistencies and exceptions in the way in which nonverbal behavioral cues are related to specific social constructs. So the typical example is that while it is known that people who tend to talk more sometimes are perceived as being dominant, in certain cultures, people might not talk more and still be the most powerful person in the team, right? There's also the very important challenge that many of these cues depend on context, depend on the specific individuals who generate the cues, depend on the relations that exist between people who interact, or depend on the specific type of interaction that is going on, and also are dynamical in the sense that people might not express the same behavior in order to acquire a certain status, for instance, than in order to maintain it. And as you can see, each of these dimensions create, on one end, potential interesting lines of research about how to address them, but also in general are going to be challenging to deal with. So in addition to that, even though the maturity of some of the perceptual processing techniques has improved over the years, some of the extraction is difficult or impossible yet, but we are getting there. So for the talk, I'm going to talk essentially about three topics. How have we characterized video bloggers using some of these automatically extracted nonverbal cues? Second, some analysis we've done trying to discover, if any, the existence of a relationship or a connection between nonverbal cues and social attention in YouTube. And finally, looking at the interplay between nonverbal behavior and personality in video blogging. And here are some references for people who would like to read more about it. So let's get started with nonverbal behavior and social attention. I decided not to spend too much time talking about all the different types of video blogs that are out there, because I know that many of you probably know better than I all the different types of video blogs you can find. In this particular talk, I'm going to be focusing on what I call conversational blogs, which are, if you want, the simplest instantiation of a video blog, which is a person in front of a camera speaking, something that they care about. This basic setting in itself has connections with, for instance, Skype, so communication over the web, or face-to-face interaction. And from the perspective of computer vision, you would say it's a relatively simple case where people are just in front of the camera. So we're going to have typically a face and shoulders, right? It's a head and shoulder situation. You can find video blogs typically on YouTube through the video page or through the user channel page. And for those who might not be familiar with the jargon in YouTube, a user channel is essentially an account that you can create. And once you have an account, you can just post video blogs or any other video you want to the account. And this essentially starts creating a collection of videos that people can browse if they decide to go to your user channel, or they can just find through text search on the video page. Our initial goal is obviously to try to have some data to work on. And I'm going to show you what we have done to collect some data to analyze this. I must say this is a first exploration of how to do it, and I'm sure some of you will have interesting questions about how to do it better or how to do it at a larger scale. We wanted to study the feasibility of collecting some data without having to interact with Google, and also the possibility of collecting some data that was meaningful for the purposes we were interested in. So we want to go from all sorts of video you can find on YouTube to only video blogging. One important first point to start on this research is to actually know that video bloggers very often blog a lot. And that really creates a very interesting longitudinal data of people who can be creating this for years, right? So I was just discussing with somebody who are doing computer vision yesterday, and I was going to say, well, if you wanted to study biometrics in realistic settings, video blogs could be an excellent choice, right? Because you can have a person that changes haircut, that changes slightly the background from which they are blogging, change illumination, have glasses or not, can have hats or not, and can be there for years. So from the perspective of longitudinal data, video blogs are actually a very interesting source of information. So the first point then was to realize that some bloggers are really, really loyal to their fans, and therefore we can actually get many instances of the same person. So based on that, what we did was first to start with the simplest case. We actually went to the API of YouTube, and we got some initial set. As you can imagine, you can have access to as much data as you need. In this case, we limited roughly to in the order of 1,000 users, and also to have more or less homogeneity about the number of views that each user would have. We limited ourselves to capture only the 8 most recent videos that each person had. So the rest of the talk is going to be about relatively recent videos, if people think about, for instance, the number of views that these videos are going to get. And then we also needed to have a finite number of videos because somebody's going to manually annotate them, right? And as we know, this is an important practical point. So for manual annotation, what we had was we created essentially a tool that would show all the videos that we had for a specific blogger. And then we would use people, in this case, students in my research group and other students that volunteered to do so, to be able to essentially watch a video and then answer a very simple questionnaire. Is this video corresponding to a video blog or not? Because that particular question, is this a video blog or not, is in itself an important one. From the perspective of analysis, we're really interested ultimately in the conversational bits of a video blog. But for people who are familiar with video blogging, this can be extremely rich types of videos, right? With lots of shots, lots of edition. You can have indoor and outdoor content. You can have sometimes cartoons within a video blog. So we wanted to make sure that the type of information we were going to analyze was actually conversational. So people went and told us which video blogs were, in their opinion, conversational. And after this annotation, our initial data set was reduced to about 2,000 video blogs and about 500 users. These numbers are small, but still correspond to 150 hours of video, which is already significant, at least for academic research. And this, for instance, corresponds to the order of magnitude of some of the video analysis campaigns that happen, for instance, in TrackVid. So it just gives you an idea of how quickly you can collect data at large scale. Some basic statistics about the data are the following. For those who know of YouTube, YouTube gives you a limit of 10 minutes maximum for the length of the video you want to upload, unless you are a partner. And what you observe once you collect the videos is that that's actually true. Most people tend to upload video blogs that are short, so a median of about 3.5 minutes. And most of the videos are less than 6 minutes, right? So people upload short videos. And from that perspective, you can think of them, if you want, as thin slices of behavior. So people are already giving them very, very limited interaction. There is a few video blogs in this data set that are longer than 10 minutes, and these actually correspond to people who have a partnership with YouTube, which means they have an agreement with them that allows them to post longer videos in trade for some mutual economic benefit in terms of advertising. Another interesting aspect of this small data set is that the number of views varies significantly. This is a plot of number of views versus number of videos that have at least X number of views. And if you see the basic statistics, as I explained, these are recently captured videos. So these videos are going to be leaning towards lower numbers. So they have a median of about 230 views, so not a lot of views, and a mean of about 20,000 views. Something also that I might say here is that unlike most research in social media who is interested in looking at very, very popular people, celebrities in these media sites, I'm particularly interested in looking at the long tail, the rest of us who are never going to be very famous and whose actual number of views might be actually around this number, right? So the type of blogs we share with people in our real social networks. So these video blogs are, according to what people said, mainly conversational, but they still can contain lots of other stuff. And we need first to filter that and end up only with the conversational part. So as I said, the creation process in video blogging is rich, and therefore you can expect that any video blog will contain segments where people talk, and then other segments that will contain music and essentially every other form of content you can imagine. So we need to rely on some technique that will allow us to extract only the conversational shots, and then from there we can extract nonverbal cues. So for that, we essentially are going to use standard techniques and some basic intuitions. First, we need to select these conversational shots, and for that, we're going to use a couple of ideas. The first one is that we're going to assume that the visual content in a given video blog is going to be different for the cases where people are talking and for the cases where there's something else. And this is in practice reasonable because people would tend to include new content with specific purpose, right? And this specific content is often going to correspond to something else than the typical head and shoulders view. The second idea is that we are really interested in essentially talking heads shots. And combining these ideas, we essentially came with a method that on one end is going to detect boundaries of shots using standard techniques. In this particular case, we look at color histograms and then looking at basic techniques to find an adaptive threshold to find variations on color. And then we're going to use a frontal face detector that we can also use as a well-known module to detect faces in each frame of the shots, assuming that whatever doesn't correspond to the conversational case most likely won't contain a face. Then we will combine these two modules, and we are going to select within a given video blog which parts will likely correspond to conversation and which parts will not. One could think of many other ways of dealing with this. For instance, if we were using a speech-on-speech detection or a speech-music detection, we could also have improved the quality in terms of extracting the conversational shots. We did some experiments on a small data set, and the quality, the accuracy in terms of extracting video shots is around 80% with this technique. After we have the conversational shots, what is important is really to extract the nonverbal cues. And we're going to extract audio cues, visual cues, and some basic multimodal cues from each of the shots, from each of the conversational shots, and then we are going to decide whether we want to keep the analysis at the shot level, or we would like to merge the information from multiple shots to do the analysis at the video blog level. So let's discuss quickly about the video cues we're extracting. So these are all standard techniques used in audio processing, but some of you might not be familiar with them, so I'm just going to explain them relatively quickly. We start with, the goal is to start with the raw audio signal, and then by applying some techniques, it could be based on energy, for instance, it would be the simplest one, but there could be other techniques too. The goal is to end up with a speaker segmentation that would tell us at any given frame whether the person is speaking or not. Remember, all of these shots now are supposed to be conversational, so using this technique makes sense. So we first use work done by Sumit Basu at MIT almost 10 years ago, who has a very good speech-no-speech segmentation method that also extracts voice and non-voice regions. And after we have this segmentation, what we do is essentially to extract a number of basic cues based on the segmentation, right? We're going to extract, for instance, the amount of speaking time. So remember the slide when I mentioned people talk more, move more, and so on. So we're essentially trying to implement that here. We extract the amount of time people talk, the average length of speaking segments. This could be a very, very primitive feature for fluency. So people who tend to take longer turns probably do so because they are more fluent, so they have less pauses or disfluencies. We can also measure speaking rate, which is a measure of how fast you talk, which some studies also show that might correspond to fluency. We look at energy, and specifically at the variation of the energy with people talk, with the hope of characterizing, if you want, consistency in terms of loudness. And also we look at variations of pitch. In this case, looking variation of pitch corresponds to essentially measuring variations in tone. So these are all standard techniques used in audio processing that we are particularly using for the case of video blogs. So for visual cues, I'm showing you here just a small sample of what the phase detector gets from actual vlogs. And you can see a number of interesting patterns. First of all, many of the faces, in this particular case, we didn't only show faces, but many of the detected faces actually are faces. This is an example where this is not a face. You can actually use this as a sample to see the sort of the challenges in terms of visual analysis. There are large variations of illumination, right? This might even be the same person, and you can see that the appearance is drastically different. You can see that in some cases there's no hope of using a skin color detector, because unless you are the Hulk, there wouldn't be really any hope there. And you can see also interesting patterns in terms of actually how people look at the camera. You can see this effect that is quite common where people are somehow sort of getting close to the webcam and look at it from below. And this might or might not have been done on purpose. This in itself would be an interesting question to answer, whether people have an intention of presenting themselves like this on camera. So what we do essentially is to run the phase detector, and then we are going to use the output of the phase detector to craft a couple of basic nonverbal cues. First, I had mentioned before that these patterns of visual attention, in other words, how much you look at others, is very important in conversation. So in the case of video blogging, obviously there's no a real other, a person called other, but there's a camera, right? And there's the intention of the video blogger of communicating with their audience. So we're going to assume that when people look at the camera, it's going to be sort of equivalent to the case in which people are actually talking to somebody else. And the video blogging setting is simple in the sense that assuming that we can detect a frontal face might be a good proxy for detecting that the person is actually looking at the camera. Obviously, it's not a perfect one, but it's a reasonable one. So we first take the frontal face detector and apply it over the entire segments, and then we create a binary segmentation that in this case corresponds to moments when you look and moments when you don't look at the camera. And based on that, we extract, again, basic features like the amount of time you look and the average length of these segments when you look to have a similar feature as with audio. And in addition to that, we have used some other work in video-mediated communication that talk about framing and the fact that framing can also be important to convey attitudes and possibly to convey other constructs too. So in this case, we're interested in knowing how close the person is to the camera. And this proximity to camera can be measured in many ways. Here we're using, again, the output of the phase detector to know how far you are from the webcam. And then we're also looking at basic features of motion that can be also extracted from the videos. in the hope that we can actually identify cases where people move a lot versus cases where people are more still. And finally, we're also investigating basic features for framing, meaning how well centered you are. A little bit related to this concept I mentioned before, that people can present themselves in an upper position or a lower position. Finally, for these cues, we also studied a case that is well known in the social psychology literature, which is this dominance ratio that essentially relates the amount of time you look while you talk over the amount of time you look while you listen. Here, obviously, this feature is not entirely applicable because there's no real listening, right? But we could still measure the amount of time that people look at the camera while they are not speaking. And in this case, all we need to do is to take the previous two segmentations and then find cases where people actually actively talk and look at the camera and so on. So I have a couple of slides here to show you a little bit about the complexity of video blogging as a source of media before I jump into the results about nonverbal behavior. So what we did here was to take a random sample of 100 of the video blogs we had, and then we coded them manually for the presence of a number of, we call them artifacts. In other words, certain features that appear in the video blog. So we wanted to know, for instance, whether people added an opening snippet to the video blog, an ending snippet, some snippets in between, whether there was a soundtrack, so some music running in the background, whether people were presenting objects to the camera, and we had a few extra categories. And what we found is that all of these artifacts actually are used very often, right? So this is an indication that people are doing much more than just displaying themselves on camera. And at the same time, it shows the need to actually extract all these snippets out from the analysis in terms of behavior, nonverbal behavior. So openings tend to look like this, right? It's almost like people with mimicking professional TV having a beginning or an end, right? These are all very common practices in YouTube. And the type of snippets that people introduce in between is really anybody's guess. Then what I'm showing here is what happens in terms of automatic processing after we extract the conversational shots and discard the rest. So in this case, I'm showing a histogram of the number of shots versus the percentage of the total for the conversational shots that exist in each video. So you can see that the number of conversational shots per video tends to be small. So in some cases, you have only one, which probably means that a person had an opening, then the entire video blog came where people only talk, and then put an end, if that happened. And if it's not only one, then there's a few of them, right? But it's rare to find video blogs that have many conversational shots in them. So let's move on to the results that one can get with the simple nonverbal cues that we extracted. What I'm showing here are the distributions of 4 of these nonverbal cues over the entire population of people. So the speaking time, as I was mentioning before, summarizes how much you talk. And this quantity in this case is normalized between 0 and 1, with 0 corresponds there's no talking, and 1 corresponds you are always talking. So you can see that for this particular population, this is definitely a chatty population, so 60 to 80% of the time corresponds really to the majority of people, which sort of corroborates something that seems to be intuitive, that people are there to talk, so they talk. Another interesting feature is the average length segment, which essentially tells you how long the segments are, and if you want, how fluent people are. And you can see that the speaking segments tend to be very short, so tend to be in the order of a few seconds. So this might just be that people talk and stop and talk and stop, and somewhat they don't really get into sort of long monologues with no pauses. This essentially talks for, quick, short talk. So voicing rate refers to how fast you talk, and it's interesting to see that here you can find pretty much a sort of a Gaussian model on the variation on speaking rate. And then this shows the variation of loudness, which essentially says that there's not much variation in loudness in the population we have. So this is just to illustrate what the data contains, but if one thinks about it, it could be interesting, for instance, to think about cross-cultural analysis based on descriptors like this, right? To think about different communities within a certain country, to think about male versus female, to think about different age groups, or even to think about people from different cultures, and see whether you can find, one could find statistical differences in terms of these sort of aggregated, anonymous ways of representing behavior. So these are results for our population for video. This is the feature that corresponds to the amount of time people look into the camera, and you can see that people look a lot, which is also interesting, right? People are very often in front of the camera all the time, at least as detected by our imperfect gaze detector. But there will be some cases in which people don't seem to be looking much at the camera. And this could be, in many cases, actually processing errors. In this case, the face detector we have is highly sensitive to, for instance, in-plane rotation. So if people are not really with the camera fixed but having in a strange angle, so faces might not be detected, and there might be some errors. So obviously what we see here are not perfectly extracted cues, but also you see the effect of automatic processing. For proximity, you can also see that there's a trend of people in terms of how close they come to the camera. And it will be, our hypothesis was whether people could actually have like a two-mode distribution where you would have people who are very close and people who are very far away. We actually didn't find that necessarily. There seemed to be one strong mode in this distribution. One could also fit a mixture model and try to find the different components in the mixture. And then there were also interesting characteristics about vertical framing and motion that I'm not going to discuss much, but essentially we can also have representations for our entire population in terms of how they frame themselves into the camera and how much they move in front of the camera. One important question here would be, if we had done all this manually, would we observe statistically significant differences? And I believe this is a very interesting question that can only be done at small scale. Because annotating all of these, even for 120 hours of video, might start becoming cumbersome. So at some point, I think it will be important to accept that there will be some errors in the way the features are extracted, but if the accuracy in extraction is good enough, we can still trust the results. For the multimodal cues, unsurprisingly, we found in this ratio feature, which is how dominant you appear from this perspective, if the ratio is higher than 1 or significantly higher than 1, in face-to-face conversation, people had said, well, this person tends to have a very dominant pattern. And it's no surprise to find that that's the case, right? That the mean of this distribution is between 2 and 3. So if these people were in a conversation behaving like this, they would be seen as dominant, right? But we know this is a rather different situation. So once we had the nonverbal cues, the next question was, well, is there any relationship between this way people behave and what is probably the most studied phenomenon in social media, which is popularity or attention? We don't claim that there should be a direct relationship, but I think it was a fair hypothesis to try to investigate whether there was any relationship there. And so in social media, people have studied many different ways of measuring popularity. In the context of YouTube, the literature typically refers to aggregates of the number of views, number of comments, number of subscribers to channels, and in particular in VideoTube, number of video responses. And the real question is to try to answer is what contributes to popularity, right? So the network science literature really has highlighted the effects of this rich get richer effect, preferential attachment or other mechanisms that very often are highly responsible, if not fully responsible, for people becoming popular. But there are other aspects too. One should not forget about content. So what people say should matter, at least to some degree, at least to some people. And then there are other aspects, if you want, more psychological, that could also play a role. Does the personality of somebody affect the way in which these people are perceived and ultimately the number of views or subscribers they can get? Is it the case that better communicators tend to get more views? Is it the case that better-looking people tend to get more views? So these are some questions that we would like to address in the future. We have started doing some analysis at the level of personality. I just wanted to show that there are really many other variables that could play an interesting role that we haven't studied yet. So our first try was essentially to take the nonverbal cues we had and then to do a comparison, essentially a correlation analysis between that and the number of views. We could also have done it for other quantities. What we used here was a basic model proposed by Bernardo Huberman from HP, who published a paper a couple of years ago, where instead of caring so much about the individual level of attention that a video gets, one should rather pay attention to the average level of attention that a set of videos get. So essentially aggregate measures of attention. And the way in which he defines this average level of attention is first to have a set of n videos on which you want to compute this number, and compute essentially the log of the number of views for all the sets, for all the elements in the set, and compute the median of that. So this is already a smooth version of the number of views over a population. So we decided to use this feature for our analysis, and obviously in this case what we need to define is what those n videos should be. So for our analysis, what we do is the following. We start with a nonverbal cue, let's say speaking time. So we divide speaking time, as I mentioned here, the way we represent it is a quantity that varies between 0 and 1. So we first divide that range, in this case it's unity range, in k bins, let's say 20 or 50, and then for each of these bins, we define the set of videos on which we're going to compute the correlation analysis. We are going to first take all the videos whose whose nonverbal cue is within that bin. So let's say all the videos for which people spoke between 10 and 15% of the time. And after that, we're going to go to all those videos and compute the average level of attention. And these are the two vectors on which we're going to compute Pearson correlation. So it's essentially a smooth version over subpopulations for the analysis. So these are the results that we found. We were actually quite surprised to see that you can actually measure, based on this procedure, interesting correlations for several nonverbal cues. In this case, I'm showing the 2D plot for instance, speaking time versus this attention measure, the same for average length for audio, voice rate, time looking, vertical framing, and dominance. And what was interesting was that speaking time actually showed a very interesting pattern of correlation over these subpopulations, right? Actually quite high and significant in terms of p-values. And we also observed strong patterns for the length, the average length of the spoken segments. Framing also had a very interesting correlation phenomena, and so was time looking. There were other features, and I'm showing here one for which we didn't really observe any strong effect. So this was actually quite puzzling to ourselves, because I mean, we knew that we were doing some coarse smoothing, and the smoothing should take care of a lot of the noise in this system. By noise, I'm saying that there might be videos that have 20 views, and there might be videos that have 1 million views, right? So the smoothing, in terms of the median that Huberman proposed, actually gets rid of a lot of these, if you want, sources of noise. But it was still quite interesting to notice that these effects are still there. We did experiments varying the number of bins, so from 30, 40, 50. So we did this over multiple bins, and we actually did some statistical analysis to see how much of this could be due to random fluctuations, and we found that that's not the case. So there's actually some effect that we can observe and measure, and therefore there seems to be some correlation. Obviously, there's no causality that we can imply or suggest, but there's some correlation between some of the way people talk and some of the way they are perceived. Another question that came at that time was whether we should be doing something wrong because we don't take into account the age of the video. Because number of views is a constantly increasing quantity. So videos that are older can in principle have more views. So what we did then was to take the age of the video in days, as you can see here, and we also, first we observe a strong correlation between the number of views or the level of attention and the age of the video. And then we essentially normalized over the age of the video for each of the blocks, and we went back to the statistical analysis, and interestingly, we didn't really find any differences with respect to the plots we have here. So even after we compensate for the age effect, we still can find the types of correlation I showed in the previous slide. So that really brought us to ask ourselves, so what is happening? Why is it that something as simple as speaking time has to have anything to do with the number of views they get? And this was one of the motivations to look at personality, because we thought that maybe personality has an effect that is probably really more fundamental than just the number of accused as such. And this is what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. We have studied personality from the perspective of the Big Five personality trait model. So I know that this is, again, textbook information for some of you, but it might be new for some others. So the Big Five model is essentially a data-driven model based on factor analysis that posits that personality can be expressed as a continuous space of 5 dimensions that are defined as follows. Extraversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and openness to experience are the so-called Big Five. And then here I'm just putting keywords that, if not defined, at least evoke what these traits correspond to. So extroverted people, typically on personality tests, rank high on being outgoing or enthusiastic, and people who are low on extroversion tend to be seen as aloof or quiet. For neuroticism, people tend to be prone, for people who score high on neuroticism, they tend to be prone to worry and stress, and people who score low tend to be emotionally stable. So this trait is sometimes called emotional stability. Conscientiousness relates on one end of the spectrum to organized and self-directed people, and in the other to spontaneous or careless people. Agreeableness is on one end, the high score, related to trusting or empathetic people, and on the low score to hostile or uncooperative individuals. And finally, openness to experience is exactly that. People who can be, if they score high, creative or imaginative, and if they score low on this trait, practical or conventional. So this is a model that has been used actually quite often recently in social media studies as a representation of people's personality. So before I tell you what we did exactly, I'm going to just quickly review some recent work. You can see many of these works are from last year, that people are also very interested in looking at personality in different sources of different types of social media. So people agree that we on social media tend to express our personality through what we post. And one very interesting study has been done by Sam Gosling and collaborators at UT Austin. They found that Facebook profiles actually are really great setting to study personality impressions. And they found that when actually external people look at profiles on Facebook and rank the personality of the people they see, those judgments are often corresponding fairly well with the self-report of personality. In this case, the people who actually posted the profile. Other works have also documented that some of these elements in the profile can be associated with significant levels of agreement with respect to personality impressions, which means personality perceptions. And other people have been doing really interesting work on analyzing personality from the text perspective, so looking at text blocks and trying to also find effects with respect to the Big Five using text as source. So in our follow-up study, what we did is essentially we took a subset of the videos. In this case, if you remember, we had several videos for each person. So in this case, we decided to use only one video per person. So we are looking at specific bloggers. So we tend to have around 450 video blogs. These are relatively balanced in terms of gender. And what we decided to do was just to use the first minute of the blog instead of the entire blog to control for effects of length. And we wanted to run these experiments on the web. So we wanted to use a personality test that was short. And a personality instrument that has been used commonly in the last few years has also been proposed by Sam Gosling, and it's called the TIPI, the 10-item personality instrument, which essentially what the acronym stands for is 10 questions. And there will be 2 questions per trait. And Gosling has documented that this very short test has very good properties in terms of agreement with longer personality tests, has very good test-retest properties, and so on. So if you want to run personality online, you need to do it quick, especially if you want to do it on Mechanical Turk, because people are going to get bored and give you garbage. So we essentially posted a job on Mechanical Turk, which consisted in the following. We asked people to look at the blog, the video blog, and then to fill the TP. And what we needed is, on one end, we wanted to have what is called zero acquaintance judgments, which is people who don't know these people. We cannot guarantee that on Mechanical Turk, but I think in principle it's a reasonable assumption. And we wanted to have at least a small number of annotators per video. So we gave ourselves the goal of getting 5. Of course, we could have many more, and this would be a better practice, especially on infrastructures like Mechanical Turk. So in the end, we're going to have in the order of 20,000 jobs. So looking at the statistics on the people who actually fill the annotations, we end up with in the order of 100 workers that after many experiments, this is the part where I'm going to sort of skip because this could be an entire talk in itself. A Mechanical Turk is not as easy as it seems, so you need actually to build experience about how much you pay, how you incentivize people to participate, how long can the test be before people sort of opt out or do not do the questionnaires fine. And obviously there's the price, right? So we also found that it would be better to rely on people who spoke English to make sure that they understand the questionnaire. And we wanted to test at least 2 different populations to test for a trade-off between payment and return, and also potentially to look for, once we have more annotations, to look for maybe cultural differences between US type of annotators and India type of annotators. So the TP doesn't take much time to complete, so the questionnaire itself, on average, took only 36 seconds for a person, which is actually sort of half of what Gosling reported that it takes to do in the lab. So this is actually a very common finding in Mechanical Turk studies, that people tend to do it faster because there's an incentive to do it faster. We have done some basic reliability study using ICC, which is a well-known feature. Essentially 2 variations of that, one that takes into account the reliability of single judge ratings, which is ICC 1.1, and another one that takes into account the reliability of multiple judges and taking the ratings mean. And what we have found for the different personality traits is that there's in general, for the single annotation case, sort of low to moderate reliability. Higher reliability was obtained for extraversion, and slightly and lower for agreeableness. And then for the aggregates, which is this ICC 1K, we found higher reliability in all cases. So we were at least encouraged by these results to try to see, well, we can use this as basic information to run correlation analysis with respect to the nonverbal cues. So the audio cues were extracted as before. We didn't do anything different. So we extracted the same features I explained before. And for video, we actually try a new feature. We were interested in characterizing the overall body motion, not necessarily focus on the face or focus on the body or focus on the hands, but having like a motion texture feature. So what we did was to modify a feature that was proposed some time ago now in the computer vision community that has been very successful to characterize real activities, as in people sitting down, walking, running, and so on. In this case, we wanted to use it for conversational settings. So what we essentially do is, I'm not going to go through the math, actually. I'm just going to say that each of these features essentially summarize in one image an entire video. And what this weighted motion energy image corresponds to is that each pixel in the image is going to be the amount of motion that was measured in that particular location throughout the video. So you can think of cases where nobody moves, you have a black image, and cases where everybody's moving all the time consistently is going to be a white image. And what you're going to have in between is what you actually see there. After we extract this image, what we then use as actual features are statistics of that. The mean, the median, this is a table, the entropy, and some other basic statistics about these images. So what is interesting is that these are sort of examples of what you can find. And this is how the features look from a few subjects. It's interesting this because you can see, for instance, cases where people are fairly still, right? So if they move, they essentially move where they are, but they don't seem to gesticulate. There are other cases where people tend to move more, there will be cases when you can actually recover the gestures that people are doing, and this has to be some form of constant pattern that people have, and that shows up in the feature image. And this is a case where people are either moving a lot, or might be even that the camera is sometimes moving itself, right? I wanted to show you some interesting experiments one can do with this feature. So we can cluster these images, right? So for anybody who has done any image processing, we can just take features and then cluster based on the features. We have done that, and this is actually just to illustrate the type of patterns that blogging from this perspective looks like. If we use a basic k-means algorithm and define 3 clusters, these are the cluster means that one can extract. You can see that they roughly correspond to different amounts of motion, right? One in which pretty much what moves the most is the face region, another one when there's more motion, and really another one when people are probably having really a lot of activity well beyond the face. If we, for instance, use now 5 clusters, you can see that this becomes roughly a refinement of the previous case, where now you're going to have, again, cases where you have very little motion outside the face, a little bit more motion in the shoulders, and essentially grades of shade between the other cases, to the case where essentially people are really moving a lot, and so on. So what we did then is to use the features extracted from video, the older features we have from audio, and then to run, again, correlation analysis based on this measure of attention that I discussed before. So here are the results. I have separated here results for audio and for video, and these correspond to the big 5: extraversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, so this is neuroticism, or neuroticism and openness to experience. This is emotional stability. That's why the acronym doesn't match. So I'm showing here all the features we use for the study for audio and for video, and here I'm showing in red cases where we have obtained some degree of statistical significance. So overall, if you just look at the columns that have more reds, extraversion and openness to experience were the cases for which we found higher correlations. In some of the cases, as you can see here, the correlations are actually meaningful, are of a moderate to reasonable value. You can see here that speaking time still plays an interesting role. For instance, for conscientiousness, has the one that provides the highest correlation we found. And you can see that the stars correspond to actual significant p-values. As I said, also, speaking time has an effect on openness to experience, although it's much smaller. Then features that correspond to speaking terms, this basic measure of fluency, seem to have a negative effect with respect to extraversion. So this will be this feature over here. Then these features that relate to F0 correspond essentially to a fundamental frequency, and this speaks of autocorrelations. All these features are measures of voice quality. They mainly show effects with extraversion. And then for visual activity, we actually found that these features derived from the overall motion texture feature were quite meaningful, whether you use the entropy, the median, or the mean. Later, we did a linear regression test and found that if we combine all the features, we could explain up to 34% of the variance for the extraversion case, which is essentially the only one for which we can obtain really significant effects. This in itself is interesting because many other studies have also reported that that effects can be found with extroversion, but not with the other big 5. So finally, to conclude the story, we come back to this idea of, we found before that there was a correlation between specific nonverbal cues and the number of views. Here what we are looking at is if there's any correlation between the scores that people gave to the different traits and the number of views. And what you can see here are for the big 5. So extraversion is here. You can see that in terms of scoring, there's also some strong correlation found for p less than 10 to the minus 3. And that also for openness to experience, a correlation effect was found. It's less so for the conscientiousness case. Again, there was in this case no correlation between the test, personality tests, and a number of views for agreeableness and for emotional stability. So overall, it just seems that, at least from the data we found, and with the annotation procedure we followed, that people who tend to be more extroverted, open to experience and conscientiousness, tend to get higher levels of attention. So this is really the beginning of what should be a larger scale study to try to verify these initial findings, but at least we can see that there's some promise there with respect to connection between personality and behavior. So let's conclude. I have presented this idea of analyzing video blogs from the nonverbal perspective as a novel direction in social media. Obviously, it comes more from the direction where I come, which is computer vision and audio processing, but I think we can actually bring something new in terms of analysis to the social media community. I have shown that whether it's true that we have used simple extraction methods, we can already observe some interesting results. Obviously, we would need better techniques for more subtle cues. So for instance, facial expression is one, detecting specific postures would be one, having, for instance, a skeleton model to try to actually track hands and at least the basic body parts that you would have in a blog would be good. And obviously, ultimately, we will need methods to be able to account in a better way for personal differences. Right? In this case, we're using some basic forms of normalization, but we really need to go beyond that. And then the main results, on one end, we found that some of these cues are correlated with average levels of attention and with personality traits in terms of perception of personality traits. And also we found that for personality traits, also there was a correlation with some of the traits with average level of attention. Finally, one interesting spin-off in terms of research is that once you start thinking about annotating these large-scale infrastructures like mechanical Turk become really interesting, but then potentially also very risky in terms of the quality you get. And therefore, it's really important to think about principal models to essentially characterize annotations of social perception or social constructs using crowdsourcing. And this is in itself an interesting modeling task on which we have also done some work. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Could you make a comment as to whether or not traits like agreeableness is just possible to convey through a broadcast medium, or does it seem like we need interaction in order to determine that trait?
Did anybody hear the question? Shall I?
You have to repeat all the questions.
Okay. So you asked whether agreeableness and?
The other one that showed no correlation, neuroticism.
Yeah.
Are those,
Okay.
those traits that require?
Okay. So the question was whether for the traits that didn't show any effect, whether could it be because they can actually not be shown typically through blogging, but only through face-to-face interaction, right? That's an interesting question. So my guess would be that if you knew the person, if you were a part of the community of this blogger and you had seen this person enough, maybe you could actually make some accurate judgments about these other traits. Maybe it's more difficult to observe only from a thin slice, but also there might be an effect on the type of features we are using, right? It might be that, for instance, if we were using a facial expression recognizer, we could be capturing, for instance, expressions that relate to negative emotion. And it's known that negative emotion has some effects on the neuroticism dimension. So it might be that we are just not using the right modules for that. Yes?
I'm curious if there is a correlation between having certain personality types and being much more likely to be doing a vlogcast to begin with.
Right, that's a very good question. Actually, I think it's more or less easy to understand that for people to actually be doing blogging, they have to have some form of baseline level of extraversion, right? And that's not a reasonable assumption. So I would totally agree with that. The next question is, how do we actually measure that, or how do we actually compensate for that? Which also relates to the question on how biased is this sampling, this population with respect to the general population, right? And unfortunately, the data we have is really all we can have access to. It would be great to have access to video blogs of people who are not that extroverted, but they won't be on camera, right? You can actually see also you can actually also see that effect of bias in just in the dynamic ranges of the scores, right? This was a 7-point scale in the original, and you can see that maybe you can already observe some biases, right? Whether it was a 10-point scale or 7-point scale, you can already imagine that there could be some bias that maybe you won't see a lot of zeros and ones being given to extroverted people who are doing blogging. So I don't know if that answers. Mm-hmm. I actually forgot to repeat the question. No, but that's okay. I think people understood. Yeah.
A little bit related to that previous question, but I guess you talk about sort of personality of the video bloggers, sort of personality innate to that person, but I was curious about sort of the effect of I guess video blogging as a genre, and how much of that extrovertedness is because of this sort of norm associated with the genre of video blogging, and how much of that extrovertedness or expression of extrovertedness or expression of other personalities probably comes from sort of norms and practices in other sort of video media, something like TV shows.
Right. So let me try to rephrase for everybody. So the question was whether it could be that because of standard or normal YouTube practices that are creating cultures around certain genres, what we would be observing is that people behave extroverted because everybody within this blogging genre behaves extroverted. So how much of a mirroring effect could be, or just a imitation effect can be. And I believe this is a very interesting way of looking at the problem, because it is certainly true that there's a large degree of imitation and following, right? This is a culture of following what other people do. And I wouldn't be surprised that in specific age ranges, people might actually be quite prone to do as their friends do in terms of how they present themselves on camera. But it could also go actually beyond what people actually show themselves. It could be that even the way they edit their videos, even the way in which they tend to insert specific snippets at specific times, creating their videos in specific forms, could also be the result of this genre culture. So I agree with you that this could play a very interesting role that would be interesting to study, maybe in the context of multiple communities. Yeah.
I mean, an interesting follow-up to that seems like it would be running the same procedures you described here on something like network news broadcasts. Mm-hmm. Since you have examples of mainstream traditional media where people stare into the camera, mm-hmm. And then this might help you understand to what degree YouTube is inventing some new norms, right, or aping others. I mean, both are artificial situations.
Right, right. Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think I have read at least some literature where people talk about certain types of bloggers, the ones who are interested in making their video blogs looking more like professional shows, essentially trying to follow the norm from professional media. Even the idea of inserting opening and ending snippets with credits and so on is already a way of moving in that direction. So it would be a really nice experiment to do, to try to compare. Yeah. Yes.
I apologize in advance about beating a dead horse and or talking about things that are obvious to communications people, but the question is, so if we have these 5 personality types, what would happen if you apply these kinds of tests to, say, an actor whose job it is to be able to ape any of these personality types? And would people who are on camera on YouTube be prone to being able to mold themselves into whichever one suits them at the time?
So I'm not a social scientist, so I have to say I don't know about any paper that potentially addresses that particular question. My guess is that Hollywood is partly successful because of that, because actors can actually embody a wide range of personalities and make you believe that they are but they're not, right? But if anybody else has more experience on personality research, I would be happy to hear your opinions. Yes?
I would like to know what's the political goal behind all this research?
So right now there's no political goal. At least,
Question.
oh yeah. So the question is, what is the political goal behind this research? And so the easy answer is there's no political goal so far, but obviously there might be some sort of assumptions about the validity of this research in the political context. The motivation for us has been to really be able to see whether the technology themselves, the technology led themselves to characterizing populations in an alternative way that text blocks have done it, right? So our original motivation has been descriptive in the first place. And after that, in terms, for instance, of applications, we could talk offline if you wanted. I think many of the applications that I personally think would be useful would be to create some form of self-social awareness that would, some self-social awareness system that was individually acceptable and that was mainly used for sort of self-learning. That would be my direction to go in terms of applications, right? So something that you could use as a mirror that could essentially tell you how you are doing, and that only you have access to that, and you decide when to use it and when not, for purposes of just knowing how you did today, right?
So, I guess it's somewhat similar, but so you correlated, you analyzed your motion features to the personality types, and the personality types to popularity. What if you just try to correlate the motion features against and audio features against popularity directly?
So the question was, why didn't I correlate the motion features with the popularity? So we actually did that, but maybe I didn't show that particular. That was the first part. That was the slide that showed the 6 different plots. So it's this one. So I just didn't have room to plot all the features, but so I have some of the features here, but not all of them. So motion is in the paper reported. And unfortunately, I don't remember the exact correlation value. We observed it, but you can find it in the paper. Any other questions? So if not, thanks for your attention.